What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a review after 100% for Encased. Encased is a post-apocalyptic sci-fi CRPG, but to get some things out of the way right off the bat, I review games after 100% pretty regularly to set me apart from other reviewers on YouTube. However, when you hear review after 100%, you might have some questions about everything that actually entails. Broadly speaking, it does include the achievements, however, it does also include quite a few other things as well. If you're curious, I made a whole video covering this topic. If you're not subscribed to my channel and you click on my channel, it should be the first video that pops up. And it kind of gives a quick dive into everything I cover for these type of reviews. That said, getting 100% on this particular game took me around 50 hours, give or take. I had about 65 hours in the game while it was in beta and then early access. Because, full disclosure, I did actually back this game on Kickstarter all the way back in 2017. In fact, if you buy this game and you go to the credits, you can in fact find the channel's name there. But Encased was developed by Dark Crystal Games. It is their first outing as a studio, though there is some experience at the studio itself. But with that stuff out of the way, let's actually dive into the rest of this. Starting out with difficulty options. There are a few different difficulty options. Most of them primarily just affect two things: enemy damage, as well as the survival stats, if you will. Because while you're traveling around this game, you're going to be getting hungry, getting thirsty, and getting fatigued, which means you need to eat, drink, and sleep. How often you need to do those things is in fact dictated by the difficulty you choose. Overall, I wouldn't say any of them are particularly hard. It's just how much do you want this to be like a survival game versus just having fun, really, is what it boils down to. But that said, let's talk about character creation itself. This is an isometric, top-down, turn-based CRPG. So when you're creating your character, you kind of go all in and kind of decide what character you want to make and how you want to play the game. Now, if this is your first time playing this game or similar RPGs, that can feel a little daunting. That said, Encased uses its own role-playing rule set. That means that the rules that govern the combat as well as the role-playing and just the game in general were in fact made by Dark Crystal Games. If you're ever curious how a lot of this stuff is calculated, hovering over something will typically actually show you the calculation, such as your attributes, times or minus, this type of thing. It will actually show you how they're arriving at the numbers, which I thought was a nice thing to go over. But beyond that, we have a few different things I want to call out. In terms of actual attributes and that type of stuff, we have our base attributes. These are pretty much what you'd expect if you've ever played a role-playing game. You know, muscle is your strength, brains is your intelligence, guts is like your endurance. And they do basically all of that stuff. Now, they do affect the calculations, like I mentioned, in different ways. However, again, those calculations are usually displayed on a mouse over. Adjusting your base attributes will give you access to a few different things, but more directly, it will influence your secondary attributes. These are things like how many action points you start combat with, because the turn-based combat uses an action point system. Secondary attributes also includes things like how much AP you can save per turn, provided you didn't use all of it in your turn, and other things like how much movement speed you actually have, like how many feet you can cover in one turn. And another interesting one is learnability. I actually want to call this one out in particular because learnability basically means how much experience you gain, which is affected by quite a few different things and not just your base attributes. But in addition to the secondary attributes, the base attributes actually also affect what perks you can get later in the game. However, you won't be picking any of those right at character creation, typically speaking. What you will be picking at character creation is what wing you are from. You essentially are an employee of a company, which we're about to talk more about right after the character creation part here. You are essentially an employee in this company, though, and it is divided up into 5 wings. Picking a wing does a couple different things. It kind of gives you some bonuses towards specific things. For instance, Silver Wing, the administrative wing, gives you points in charisma as well as like psionics and stuff. Kind of leaning in on that you rely on other people to do the work for you type of thing. Whereas Black Wing, the security wing, gets bonuses to actual combat, that type of stuff. Now, none of the wings are like a set in stone for your build, but of course picking a wing that is relevant to the type of character you want to make is only going to help you. That said, wings beyond that are actually also conversation options, because being a member from the Silver Wing will give you different options in dialogue related to being an administrator. All of the wings are fairly well represented in this way across the game, though I do want to mention that while wings might at first seem like a faction, not so much. Think of wings more like a background than anything else, but we'll talk more about that in a minute. Next up, we have the abilities. Abilities are divided up into 2 groups, combat and applied. Encased is a game you can beat in a pacifist run, or a stealth run, or a mastermind run, which is where you use your companions to do literally everything and kill no one yourself, which means that grouping these two is very helpful, actually, because combat, of course, primarily affects combat, and the applied skills are more about interacting with the environment in some way. Now, a couple things on the abilities themselves. They're divided up into 5 tiers. Each and every type of ability will be able to take up to 150 skill points. At 30, 60, 90, 120, and 150, this will unlock a new tier of skills, for lack of a better word, for your character to utilize, which can be active, passive, can give you benefits. For instance, one of the 150 skill levels just gives you a straight level up. And again, it is actually possible to make an entire build to do a pacifist run with in which you don't touch combat at all. So what winds up happening here from experience is that you are able to make a character very much so that plays the game you want to make this. So if you want to be a pacifist, that is very possible. There's an achievement for doing it. You can check my Steam page. I actually did manage to do that, of course, so it was a good time. Now that said, there are a couple of skills that I find come up more than others. Namely, lockpicking is king. Like, if you want to get around any situation, it can almost entirely be done through the criminal ability, which gives you access to like pickpocketing and lockpicking. I mean, almost every situation you can lockpick or pickpocket your way around. It was a big part of my pacifist playthrough as well as several other playthroughs. So without going into too much detail, lockpicking has so much more value than almost any other ability in the game. For instance, there's hacking in the game, which is helpful. However, there is far less interactions that come up than compared to just, say, picking the lock on something. The same thing with piloting. Piloting will let you do 2 things. It'll let you drive cars in the wasteland personally, as well as use servo shell armor, which is like power armor from Fallout. Now, the power armor part of that is pretty useful if you want to build like a big tanky power armor style build. However, the piloting, not so much. It only really comes up on the world map when you are in fact driving your car through text events. And because of that, some of these skills will be underrepresented compared to some of these skills being almost, in my opinion, necessities, even though I know technically they are not. That said, some of these skills are definitely underrepresented compared to others, at least on the applied ability side. Combat, kind of just comes up as you use it. The combat skills are as relevant as you want them to be, depending on how you build your character. Whereas on the applied side, some of these are definitely used more than others. And then that brings us to traits. Traits are pretty straightforward. You pick a positive and you take a detriment as a trade-off. If you are playing a low intelligence character, which is someone with a brain stat of 2 or less, you are automatically given the trait as a bag of hammers, which gives you the unique low intelligence dialogues. But there's all sorts of stuff here, kind of just varies up the gameplay a little bit. I didn't find personally any of them particularly interesting myself, but there's some options I could see people probably being into here. And then after this, once we start leveling up in the game, we will actually get perks. Perks are dependent on your base attributes primarily, meaning that in order to take perks, you pretty much have to be a certain level, as well as have certain amounts of points in base attributes. On one hand, the game did a great job of always making sure that no matter what your stat spread was, there was something here that was interesting for you. The problem is that the scope is still a little narrow, so it kind of feels like you're pushed into a build because of lack of options sometimes on the perk side of things. But there are nonetheless some interesting options. You can take perks that force you to be a lone wolf by reducing your party size to 1, thus you can't take companions around. There are perks that lean into that mastermind build where you take a penalty to your health, but your companions gain a bunch of things. So there are some interesting perk options, and I think overall, considering this is a unique system to a company's first game, I think overall it's pretty robust. But now that we've talked about the character building side of things, which is just a point of interest for me, let's talk about the story setup actually a little bit. So I mentioned that you're an employee of a company. Well, what is this company doing? Why are you employed there? That type of thing. Well, the company is called Cronus. Cronus was formed after mankind discovered the Dome. The Dome is sort of an ancient civilization's lost ruins of sorts. It has some interesting quirks that make the game setting rather interesting. As I mentioned, the game is post-apocalyptic sci-fi. However, the game is set in the 70s because the Dome was discovered in 1971, and that's when Cronus was formed to start basically going in, researching relics, and sending them back out. However, the Dome is only semi-permeable. People can go in, but they cannot leave. Items, however, seem to be able to freely flow back and forth. So Cronus hires people, sends them into the Dome, They know, of course, full well that they will never be coming back out, most likely. However, we do see people throughout the games researching potential ways through this semi-permeable barrier. And shortly after you yourself arrive, after making your character, you get sent on a mission to investigate a disturbance at the Nashville facility. Once you're there, you encounter some sort of strange object, and seemingly the dome kind of wakes up, as a way to put it. It seals off the dome completely, and the place is turned into a bit of a wasteland with the people that are inside the dome basically, over a couple of years actually, separating out, making factions, and honestly just trying to get by in this dome. If you're wondering how big the dome is, in in-game time it takes about 2.5 days to travel from one end to the other in a vehicle, so it's pretty big. But overall, pretty interesting concept for a post-apocalyptic setting. Now you might be wondering, is there anything more? And yeah, a little bit. So what they are actually doing in here, what the employees are looking for and researching and doing, is ancient relics from this lost civilization that they call the Forefathers. These relics do all sorts of crazy stuff. Some things are helpful, some things are harmful. They can do everything from manipulate time to carry your burdens, seemingly. And that's kind of the sci-fi part of it. So you can encounter some of these relics and use them as equipable items. And they just make for some interesting storytelling because they're kind of a plot device, to be honest. So they are capable of doing a lot of things in the name of telling an interesting story. That is what Cronus was actually doing, was researching these things, shipping the relics and things afterwards once they'd studied them and deemed them safe back to the outside world, where that technology was then, used to advance society. After the dome wakes up, you are sort of held in stasis for a couple years, and you wake up to the new wasteland world. It's at least a couple years in the future. I'm not sure of the exact amount of time in between your stasis and the wake up period, but you wake up a few years later, because again, you were held in some sort of stasis by the artifact you were in. And that's kind of where the prologue ends and the Act 1 of the game begins. And you are thrust out into the world. So that brings us to world building. So for starters, the world involves 6 factions. 6 factions have rose up in the absence of, any sort of societal structure because of everything that's happened in the dome. And those 6 factions are, for starters, the New Committee. The New Committee is basically what was left of the actual Cronus organizational structure. They're organized, they're fairly reminiscent of an actual, functioning society and government. And largely, they're just trying to get by and do the best they can for everybody. Some more ruthlessly than others, and it involves a lot of bureaucracy, you could say. Then there is the Fops. The Fops are basically raiders. When the artifact woke up, otherwise known as the Maelstrom, as it came to be called, some people had a seemingly adverse reaction to this thing, or its psychic radiation that it was giving off, and it drove them kind of crazy. Those people became the Fops. They're just kind of mentally unstable raiders, would be the best way to put it. Then we have the Phalanx. Phalanx is a sort of security team. They are very much so, kind of the military might under the dome. They do a lot of the heavy lifting security type stuff. Then we have Carmine Heights. Carmine Heights is a scientific outpost, basically. They handle a lot of the research that is still going on. They are looking into ways to get through the dome's semi-permeable barrier even now, looking for a way for people to leave. They are also growing food in labs so people can eat, and they are the ones actually processing all the water, from what I can tell. Then we have the Picnic Neutral Zone. This is actually just one area, but it's basically where the people there have decided not to deal with all the faction infighting that's going on. And while everyone under the dome is, for the most part, fairly civil, the Picnic's having none of it. They just believe in trying to get everybody through this to the best of their ability, and they take able bodies in at the Picnic Neutral Zone. Then we have the Maelstrom Church. These people are very interesting. They are basically practicing escapism by using virtual reality goggles to help people escape the dome, not through, of course, actually escaping, but rather the concept of escapism. So they have a bunch of people who live almost exclusively, practically, in virtual reality. And they're an interesting bunch. I don't want to spoil too much of the faction stuff, but the Maelstrom are interesting. Now, all of these factions will actually interact. For instance, if you kill the leader of a faction, other factions may or may not appreciate that. thus affecting your standing with those factions as well. You can help or hinder these people as you continue through the game. Now, you will be forced to interact with them in some way, because while you're researching what happened, all that stuff, as the story and plot continues and everything, as you might imagine, everyone's very curious about what event sealed off the dome. Thus, all these factions have a vested interest in what that is, because what it manifests as is this thing called the Maelstrom. Maelstrom is like simultaneously an actual storm that is happening, but it also seems to radiate psychic radiation, which drives people insane. So when you show back up out of the blue, there's still people around who remember you being sent there. And you're kind of caught in the middle of all this drama trying to figure out what this Maelstrom is, how it activated, how it came to dominate the dome. And the storyline sees you interacting with all these factions and needing something from each of them. Now, this is where the game actually genuinely gets pretty interesting, because there isn't really a wrong approach here. You can do basically anything you want to do. You can kill them, you can go in and steal exactly what you need if you know how to get it, if you know where it is. You can play nice and do all their errands until you learn where the thing is and then go steal it, that type of stuff. There are a variety of approaches for the objectives. And again, that's one of the strongest points of the game, is the fact that you can really approach all of this stuff in whatever manner you want to within all of these role-playing options. They really did leave it kind of wide open. Now, in addition to those things, the world is also comprised of course, radiation, as you might imagine. This game is heavily inspired by two very specific games, I would say, but you kind of get the post-apocalyptic vibe just kind of from a lot of different places. But the game obviously draws inspirations from Fallout and Stalker. Now, we do see radiation in certain places. This requires us to, of course, have protection against radiation. Radiation comes up occasionally, like 4 or 5 places here or there, that kind of thing. Now, the other thing is the anomalies. The anomalies are all like straight out of Stalker, basically, if you've ever played that game, where you have to like throw bolts at anomalies to set them off so you don't walk through them. But there are things that, like, when something goes through them, they activate. It does everything from, like, fry someone to burn you. They have one called the meat grinder, which just disintegrates people, basically. So a lot of interesting stuff as you traverse the world. But that said, how are we actually traversing the world? Well, it's a CRPG, so ultimately it's a world map. Again, as you're going around, survival mechanics are definitely a part of that. You have to eat, drink, and sleep. You can see those little bars in your character menu as well as on the world map. It'll show you how much of these stats you're going to gain when you travel throughout the place. So basically you're traveling from map to map, jumping from the world map into actual game space. But I did want to mention 2 things on this front. One, after you've been to submaps inside of an area, for instance, if you go to the first place, Junktown, and then go into, say, like the sewers of Junktown, the next time you enter Junktown from the world map, you can actually choose which one of those maps you want to jump to, which is a nice little quality of life feature. Second, as you're traversing the dome, you will potentially come across vehicles. One in particular I wanted to mention because it is called Ursula. Ursula was actually a sort of train that used to prowl the dome for Cronus, doing all sorts of stuff, delivering things. And you can find and restore that train and use it as your primary vehicle, which then operates as a sort of base on the go for you, which I thought was really neat. So overall, honestly, just a lot of fun exploration stuff. There's a lot of areas that you aren't sent to by the main story at all, so there's plenty of stuff to explore outside of the main story. But with that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about companions. So there are 6 companions. None of them are romanceable. Most of them have like one quest, usually around their introduction. And while they do have kind of dialogue and they do react to the main story, they do feel a little less than fleshed out because you don't get a ton of interaction with them. Most of your interaction comes when you actually recruit them. And then once you have them with you, there's not a ton that they say outside of occasionally reacting to things going on in the story. But these companions are Fox. She is a Fops raider with a personality disorder who wears a fox mask to manage that. We have Crump, who deals in unarmed fighting. He is an orange wing person, that is to say he's an ex-con. And he likes to use violence to right the wrongs of the world, basically. Then we have Cheerful Jack. He used to be an actor before everything happened in the dome. He's also very good with contraptions, which is like mines and stuff, as well as melee weapons. We have Yoko. Yoko is a robo-kid, that is to say like an android. Then we have Katarzyna. She is like a jaded scientist you meet early on. She's likely the first one you will meet, actually. And then we have Sparrow. Sparrow is a sort of like vigilante bounty hunter type person who sees all of the bandits and things taking advantage of the dome, as wrong, basically, and they want to sort that out, hence the vigilante type stuff. Combat. Combat is interesting. Combat is, as I mentioned, turn-based. It uses an action point system, primarily with our combat skills that we talked about earlier. However, the interesting thing about combat is that, as I mentioned, there's a pacifist run, which means you don't have to engage in combat literally at all. Or you could go all in on the combat and turn yourself into a killing machine. You could go the mastermind route and put all your points in making your companions killing machines. Now, overall, pretty simple combat system. It being action point based, you can basically do whatever you have with the action points that you have, which will be increased or decreased by your base attributes from earlier. The main things I want to mention about combat specifically, though, is that there is a really fun amount of variety to all of the weapons available to you. They really went out of their way to try to make just a ton of fun and interesting weapons, which is good because otherwise the system might be a little bland, frankly. But, you get all sorts of energy weapons, melee weapons, melee bladed weapons. You can do unarmed, you can do psionics, which is psychic stuff, which is a fun way to do combat. That is actually broken up into 4 different subtypes of psychic damage. All of these combat abilities come with unique abilities that of course can cost you action points to use and give you fun ways to deal with combat. There's also unique things like under the contraptions abilities where you can basically, use mines and that type of stuff, but also more unique items that you can find around, such as teleporting machines, that type of stuff. A lot of fun variety there. However, again, the overall system is otherwise a little bland, frankly. And I did want to mention, in combat and just in general, stealth is ridiculous. So the stealth system, you can enter your character into stealth, and then when you see these white rings around an enemy, you might think, oh, that's like a dangerous zone, but it's not, actually. You can just walk in that area without it really being an issue. That just means you're in an enemy's sight, so to speak. The red circle is where that enemy will actually start to detect you. And even then, you'll still have some time to move in or out of that area before you engage in combat. Now, basically, anytime you do something that an NPC might have a problem with, a little icon will pop up after you do it with a timer. Basically, if any NPC around sees this icon, they will go into an alert mode, basically, where they'll start actively looking around for who did this thing, which is especially cool, I thought, because I noticed if you kill somebody in a town, you actually won't lose reputation or suffer any consequences until someone finds that person, which I thought was just kind of really cool because it makes a lot of sense. But the reason stealth is overpowered is because even though once you do those things, that red circle will expand, you still have so much time to just get out of the way that it's very rare that you'll actually be detected, to the point where it's even possible to kill enemies without even entering the full combat system by just kind of exploiting stealth and staying out of that red circle. All of that said, let's talk some positives and some negatives and then wrap this up. So the positives for Encased are this. I love the character building. I think they gave you a ton of options. I actually do enjoy their system. And seeing all of those options then translate to the game world, which are mostly pretty well represented in terms of things you can do for combat as well as approaching situations. They give you a lot of variety, especially for a game that costs $30. Beyond that, I thought the sci-fi story was really cool. They kind of really draw you in with the prologue, and then you're like, I want to figure out what's going on here too. So it's fun to just pick apart and try to find out and solve this mystery of what this dome actually is, or if you even find out at all. And probably the single biggest positive is, again, just the amount of ways to play through this game. The pacifist run, the using your companion style stuff, the stealthing through everywhere, the absolute psychopath murder everybody and still find a way to complete the game route, or, kind of playing the factions off one another and kind of seeing what happens there and exploring a lot of that stuff. It was just a ton of fun. Negatives. So negatives are, for me, the biggest one was pathfinding. The pathfinding is just a little clunky. Your character doesn't want to seem to move right away for starters. And then while the character you are controlling will pathfind around things, oftentimes the followers that are in your party will not. Meaning that they will often walk directly through anomalies and traps, even though your character will walk around them and pathfind around those things. On top of the fact that your companions will lag really far behind, and if you go to leave an area and they're too far behind, you have to wait until they catch up, and it comes up a lot. Beyond that, it is a little janky. So What I mean by that is that like some of the animations and things are just like a little slow and they look a little rough around the edges. And sometimes, like for instance, when combat is switching turns and things like that, it seems like the game is like loading something real quick. Cause like you can just tell like there's a couple seconds on like delay kind of, and it just like after a while it gets very grating to the point where it's like we gotta hurry this up. So it can kind of like, it just has that little bit of jank to it where you can kind of tell it's a AA game more than anything. That said, for a full conclusion, for $30, this is a great value and a lot of fun. Because again, I got about 50 hours out of this doing 100%. You could probably get like, less than that. I'd say probably 20 or 30, generally speaking. Maybe around 40 for most people. I do play games a little faster than some people, so it's always hard for me to estimate that exactly. But there's a lot of content here, and for $30, I think that's honestly a great price, especially given all the things you can do, how cool the story is. So for me, definitely worth it. Negatives aside, I do still think it's a great game. There you go, guys. My review after 100% for Encased. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. It truly does help the channel. We are growing tremendously, and I cannot thank you guys enough for that because, quite frankly, I couldn't do it without you, kind of literally. Thank you again. May you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.